If you've ever seen Fiddler on the Roof, then you know Tevye. Living in the time of the Russian Empire, Tevye is a poor Jewish farmer and father of 5 daughters, he often reminds people. His life is hard in many ways, but in one very famous scene, his countenance begins to change. A smile sneaks upon his bearded face. He moves a little quicker as this poor farmer begins to sing, "If I were a rich man." He sings about how he wouldn't have to work so hard. He would build a real home with a real floor, not just dirt. He would have chickens, enough chickens that people would hear all of them squawking and say, "Now there is a wealthy man." And as he thinks about it more and more, he starts to dance. He sings about how his wife would have enough food that she could have a double chin, how she would go around in nice clothes. He imagines the status and the respect that it would give him, bringing questions to him that would cross a rabbi's eyes, thinking, well, he's wealthy, he must be wise, and even if he's clueless about the subject, knowing that they'll still hang on every single word. He imagines time that he would have to sit and pray, to talk with the learned men for 7 hours a day, discussing scriptures, to do what he wanted to do if he were a wealthy man. It's a catchy song, but it captures many of our own thoughts about money. You see, money is something that we look to often with the hope that it will give us comfort, respect, status, relief, to grant us whatever our heart's desires, and maybe now more than ever before. You see, for decades, researchers have asked incoming college students about their goals in life. 1967, about 85% said they were strongly motivated to develop, quote, a meaningful philosophy of life. By 2000, only 42% said that. Being financially well off became the leading life goal, and by 2015, 82% of students said wealth was their aim. The desire for wealth drives us, maybe now more than ever before, even more than in Tevye's day. And yet in the middle of this song about becoming rich, we hear a hint of what else money can do. Tevye doesn't just imagine his family being able to hire servants, but sings about how his wife screams at them, bosses them around, not treating them kindly because she wouldn't have to. She's the boss. She can be bossy, even rude. And yet, sadly, it's a picture of art imitating life. In 2012, a Boston Globe article reported how a mounting body of research is showing that wealth can actually change how we think and behave, and not necessarily for the better. It cites research showing that people with wealth, on average, tend to show less empathy, even to the extent of dehumanizing those who are different from them. Despite their financial ability, they tend to be less charitable and generous. They are less likely to help someone in need and more likely to defend an unfair status quo. One study found that the feeling of wealth makes people feel less friendly, less sensitive to others, and more likely to support a statement like, "Some groups of people are simply inferior to others." Despite all the problems that money seems to solve, it creates plenty of its own. 1/3 of American couples cite money as a source of conflict in their relationship, including half of the youngest couples. Personal finance expert Dave Ramsey describes money fights and money problems as the #1 cause of divorce in America. So many hopes are tied up in money, and yet so many conflicts and character flaws seem to come with wealth. I know some of you are familiar with the famous words of Homer Simpson, who once declared alcohol to be, quote, the cause of and the solution to all of life's problems. But he could have said the same about money. See, we have a complicated relationship with money. So much hope vested in gaining wealth, and yet so many issues seem to follow those who gain it. And so this morning, we're going to look at Jesus' most famous sermon, the Sermon on the Mount, and see what he has to say in there about our relationship with money. It's in Matthew chapter 6, beginning in verse 19. This is the word of the Lord. "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moth and rust do not destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. The eye is the lamp of the body. If your eyes are good, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eyes are bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light within you is darkness, how great is that darkness? No one can serve two masters. Either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. If we're going to understand our complicated relationship with money and see that made right, we need to see what Jesus is telling us here. And so what do we see in here? Well, first we see the language of treasure. Verse 19, do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth. Verse 20, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven. What's he talking about? Well, the word here for treasure is the Greek word thesaurus, meaning that which is of exceptional value and kept safe. Think of the value of something you might find in a treasure chest. Back in the day, before they had banks, the way you would keep something safe that was valuable is you would hid it where no one could find it, usually buried underground and inside of something like a chest so that it wouldn't get ruined there. Hence the idea of buried treasure and treasure chests. It served the same purpose as a bank or a safe. And yet Jesus talks about treasure. He speaks about what we value supremely. In our English translations, he talks about storing up or laying up treasures, but in the Greek, it's actually just the verb form of treasure, thesaurizo, meaning to keep safe that which is of great value, to treat something maybe even of ultimate value. He is quite literally addressing, how do you treasure your treasures? What do you do with the things that you value supremely? We see the word money in verse 24, but Jesus is talking about more than just currency. Because in verse 19, it talks about the things that threaten our treasure. Not just about thieves who might take it, but moth and rust. You see, back then, you got to realize, your clothes were a huge part of your assets. Just think of Joseph and his coat of many colors and how jealous his brothers were because of it. But moths could ruin it all, because moth larvae eat things like wool and silk and fur and hair. It's why we have mothballs, to keep moths from destroying old clothes, because moths and rust destroy. In fact, that word for rust has this broad sense of corrosion, but more commonly referred to an act of eating, like a moth might eat your precious robe. And back when people only had maybe one set of clothing, it might have represented your whole wardrobe and maybe half of your wealth. Jesus is calling to mind the things that people treasure. He's talking about money, but more than just money. You see, older translations of this passage use a different word for money, mammon. In the Bible, mammon is a term for money and riches and possessions that people tend to trust for their security and happiness. It's literally the word trust plus an extra letter at the beginning, and yet there's a reason why we put so much trust in mammon. You see, mammon has a way of promising what we really want, whatever we value supremely, whatever we treasure, but the promise is often empty. Some years ago, I met a bank robber. And what I mean is, I wasn't in the bank when it happened. Like, I sat down, for coffee with a guy who previously robbed like a dozen banks. They called him the Bearded Bandit. And at the age of 37, long before I met him, after a crime spree that covered 2 years, he was caught. He pled guilty and then spent 7 years in prison. But here's the thing. He didn't need the money. He already lived in a nice area. He had a job. It wasn't, though, the kind of job that could afford to spend tens of thousands of dollars on prostitutes. So he began robbing banks. For him, money promised what otherwise he couldn't have had, the pleasure and the happiness that he treasured, but he pursued it in a way that ended up costing him his career and his freedom, not to mention what it did to his wife and 10-year-old child. Because that's how mammon works. It promises you one thing, the thing that you most treasure, but can just as easily deliver its opposite, and there is no telling how far it could lead you astray. And we hardly ever treasure it for its own sake. It's almost always for something else that we believe that it can give us. For example, Maybe money is the means to get the brand name clothes that promise to give you the respect and admiration of others that you so deeply treasure. Or maybe it's a way to cover up the shame that you feel inside, maybe from an impoverished childhood, or maybe from a feeling of inadequacy. Maybe new clothes make you feel new, and maybe that is what you treasure. Maybe it's the status that comes from the car that you're seen in, the house that you live in, the zip code that you have, the number of frequent flyer miles on your account. Maybe it's the sense of freedom from simply not having to say no to things that you just can't afford. Maybe it's the comfort that you treasure, and money buys you the comfortable lifestyle that you have grown accustomed to that by global standards would be considered amazingly wealthy, even if compared to your neighbors, doesn't seem that impressive. But maybe though here, you're not a spender, you're a saver. And maybe that's because what you treasure most is the peace of mind that comes from simply having money in the bank. But even that can be because above everything else, it's financial security that you treasure. Jesus speaks of money in terms of treasure, because our complicated relationship with money is never just about money, but the things that we treasure most that we look to money to do for us or to give us. It's why so many hopes can be put in money, and it's why so many conflicts end up about money, because they're almost always about something other than money. We see Jesus speaking in terms of treasure. And because of it, we see something else in this passage. We see a challenging diagnostic. Now realize, in biblical times, it was often assumed that someone's wealth was proof of their righteousness because it was seen as a blessing from God. And in our modern times, many are likely to see it as proof of unrighteousness, assuming that it was acquired by some sort of immoral or unjust practice. And while Scripture actually speaks about both realities, the diagnostic Jesus is using isn't as simple as how much you do or don't have it. It's more challenging than that. Instead, Jesus says money reveals the heart, what we truly treasure. He says, "For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." You see, your heart and your money always end up in the exact same place. It's been said that if you really want to know where someone's heart is, you just look at their checkbook, look at their bank statement, their credit card statement, follow the money, because the money follows the heart. This morning, if you want to know what your own heart is set on, what you truly treasure, follow the money. Where does your own money go? Ask yourself, where does my money go almost without thinking, effortlessly, like joyfully even? For one guy I met years ago, the answer was books. Now there's a lot of places that people might want to check out when they go on a vacation, but for him there was nothing like visiting a new city and walking up and down the aisles of a new bookstore. He loved books, and he was known to be incredibly well-read. But he confesses that's part of why he treasured books, because he wanted to be perceived as a knowledgeable person. At least part of why so much money went freely to books was a matter of his own image. What about you? Where does your money go most freely? What purchases do you make without even thinking about it? What do you adjust your budget around? What are the things that you always feel justified spending a little bit more on? Or what are the things that others might be concerned that you spend too much on? Maybe spend so much that you're ashamed to be honest with anybody about it. A poll last year revealed that more than a third of people think that their romantic partner spends too much money on impulse. And over a third of married people admit that they themselves are untruthful about money with their spouse. In fact, half of Americans confess that they often spend more than they know that they should. And the fact that so many of us know we shouldn't, and then we do it anyway, tells us there's a problem. The Bible calls it idolatry. You see, if we follow the money, if we look at what we spend too much or too freely on, it will lead us right to what we treasure, what we trust in. It'll lead us to our functional God. Because how we use our money often is an act of worship. And as one pastor put it, it's incredibly easy to give to your real God. And yet when you worship something that's not the true God, when you place that kind of infinite expectation on a finite thing, disaster follows. In his commencement address at Kenyon College, author David Foster Wallace said this: "In the day-to-day trenches of adult life, there is no such thing as not worshiping. Everybody worships. The only choice we get is what to worship. And the compelling reason for maybe choosing some sort of God or spirit type thing to worship is that pretty much everything else you worship will eat you alive. If you worship money and things, if they are where you tap real meaning in life, then you will never have enough, never feel you have enough." But Wallace doesn't stop there, because we don't stop there. Worship your body and beauty and sexual allure, and you will always feel ugly. And when time and age start showing, you will die 1,000,000 deaths before they finally plant you. Worship power, and you will feel weak and afraid, and you will need ever more power over others to keep that fear at bay. Worship your intellect, being seen as smart, and you will end up feeling stupid, a fraud, always on the verge of being found out. He concludes by saying, "The insidious thing about these forms of worship is they are unconscious. They are default settings," which means it takes a conscious effort to actually see them. And so if you want to know what your own object of worship might be, what you truly treasure, follow the money and consider what you see there. And I mean see, because money has a way of blinding us to its influence over us. Did you notice how Jesus goes from talking about money to eyes and then right back to money again? It's not an accident. You see, what we treasure determines how we see things. Jesus says, "The eye is the lamp of the body, but if your eyes are good, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eyes are bad, your whole body will be full of darkness." Maybe today we quote Shakespeare and say, "The eye is the window to the soul," which means you can learn a lot about somebody just by looking into their eyes. And while you can also learn a lot about somebody by how they use their money, it's easy to miss the imagery that Jesus is actually using. You see, eyes are what let light in so that we can see. Now, if they're working properly, your whole body functions the way it's meant to. You know, your legs walk around without tripping over things because you can see what's in your way. Your hand can reach out and actually grab something because you can see it. But if your eyes are not working, it's like everything is darkness and everything else is affected. Now, that much we can understand. But Jesus isn't simply talking about light or darkness around you. He's talking about something in you. The bad eye that he talks about in verse 23 is literally the evil eye. Back in the day, to give someone the evil eye was a curse. And what often prompted that was jealousy. Later on in Matthew 20, Jesus tells this parable where someone protests someone else's generosity, to which the generous one responds, in our translation, "Are you envious because I am generous?" But it's actually a figure of speech he uses. He literally asks, "Is your eye evil because I am generous?" You see, a bad eye, an evil eye, is an envious, jealous eye, a covetous eye. It's the opposite of being generous. That's actually what the good eye is about. A good or healthy eye is literally the single or the simple eye, the sincere eye. And when they used similar words to talk about money, the implication was generosity. The Apostle Paul writes in Romans 12 about those who give generously. He literally talks about those who give simply, meaning without strings attached, with liberality, with sincerity, not in light of what you might get in return, but with a sincere love. Old Testament scholar John Lightfoot sums it up. Among the Jews, a good eye means a bountiful mind, and an evil eye likewise a covetous mind. And the way and that's because a good eye and the mindset behind it sees money as a tool to serve. It's a means to be generous to others, to the poor, to those in need, to those that you can be a blessing to, while an evil eye sees money as a means to secure whatever we covet, whatever we idolize. How are your eyes? How do you see money? How do you use it? Does it reveal an inner light or something darker? Ask yourself, am I willing to compromise to get it or to keep more of it? Am I willing to follow a career path maybe outside of my giftings or interest or even sense of morality because it pays well? Can I give money away? What might my spending habits say about my relationship with money? You see, if envy dictates your relationship with money, if you can't be generous, if you can't be happy for what someone else has that you can't afford, if you can't give money away, if you're willing to compromise in order to get or keep money, if any of that's true, Jesus says you don't have a money problem, you have a master problem. It says in verse 24, no one can serve two masters. Either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money, because you can only truly serve one master. It's one of the reasons why you try to avoid a situation where a person has more than one boss. But when that does happen, let me tell you, it is no fun being pulled in two different directions. Back when I was in seminary, I supported myself by DJing wedding receptions. I did hundreds of them, and frankly, I've forgotten most of them. But not yours. If I did yours, I remember that. But 18 years later, there is one reception that definitely stands out. Usually we consider the bride and the groom to be our clients, and then the rest of the people as their guests. The bride booked us, she filled out the event planner, she was going to get the customer evaluation. So I wanted to make sure everything went according to her plans, and if she wants me to play a song like Right Now, I'm playing it right now. She is the boss. But beforehand, I was warned about the father of the bride, who was footing the bill. Now the bride, rightly, believed that she got final say because it was her wedding day and it was her guest that she hired me to entertain. The father thought that he got final say, including play this right now, because it was his money, even though he did not dance and could just as easily listen to that same song in his car as in that ballroom. In the middle of their struggle over Sam Cooke versus Justin Timberlake was me, their DJ. And as the night wore on, it became this all-out tug-of-war, and guess who was the rope? Pulled one way, pulled the other, between the one that I knew I should be serving and the one who offered mammon, the one who could just easily drop a $100, $200 tip for me at the end of the night. You never want to see a bride cry. Her wedding, sure, but not at her wedding reception. But that father made his daughter cry. Trying to serve two masters that night was exhausting until I finally walked up to the father and I told him, my job is first and foremost not to make your daughter cry. So I stopped listening to him, even though as I walked away, he loudly proclaimed for the whole ballroom, I'm paying for this. Trying to serve two masters is exhausting, especially when you realize that's what one of them looks like. And sometimes we need to stand up to one of them and say, I'm not listening to you anymore. See, in this world, we often feel the pull of both God and mammon, and we don't always make the right choice. It's quite possible to profess faith in Jesus Christ and yet still be ruled by mammon and its desires, to still have money as your functional master, but you can't serve both. It was Martin Luther who said, the last thing that becomes converted in a man is his pocketbook. Jesus is talking here about two different eyes, two different ways of seeing the world and money, because there are two different masters vying for your allegiance, each pulling you in a different direction, calling you to see things and think differently. And each will lead you to store up treasures in one of two different places, where it will last or where it will not. And yet, if it is where it's secure, here's what that looks like. 1 Timothy 6, Paul writes, command them to do good, to be rich in good deeds, and to be generous and willing to share. In this way, they will lay up treasures for themselves as a firm foundation for the coming age, so that they may take hold of the life that is truly life. You see, laying up treasures in heaven through a life of generosity, that's what this is about. Through giving, where money becomes not your master, but simply your tool, and you become free from its control. It's been said that really what separated Christians in the first century from those in the ancient world was that while others would be promiscuous with their bodies and not their money, Christians were the opposite. They would be promiscuous with their money, but not their bodies. Something that's no less countercultural today than it was back then. So then how is this possible? Well, we see another thing in this passage. We see in Jesus an appeal to the heart. In verse 24, he talks about love. The reason why someone serves God instead of mammon, instead of money, and what it promises us is actually because of love, because simply put, we always serve what we love. And when God is what we most love, when our relationship with money, suddenly we see falling in line with everything else, because God becomes the one that we want to serve. His values become ours, his goals ours, his end ours. God becomes our end. Money just becomes a means. And God loves to see that in his people. As Paul wrote to the church in Corinth, God loves a cheerful giver, one who gives out of the overflow of their affections, not begrudgingly, but willingly, joyfully, and freely. But if money or what it promises you is your treasure, everything else will be just a tool, even God himself. That's what we heard in the scripture reading, where Paul addresses those who see godliness as a means to financial gain. In its modern version, we call it the prosperity gospel. Paul warns about this temptation that can come with wealth that many have fallen into and still succumb to today. And why? Because of love for the wrong thing. In 1 Timothy 6, Paul writes, "For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil." That's where the evil eye comes from. The reality is that greed, which everyone agrees is a problem, but nobody thinks it's their own problem. Greed in our disordered relationship with money comes from a disordered love for money, for mammon, and whatever that represents for us. And yet when God becomes your supreme object of love, when he becomes your treasure, everything else, including money, simply becomes a tool to serve him. And let me tell you, friends, that is liberating. Because when what you treasure most is already yours, you can finally become generous with everything else. Back when I was in college, I noticed that all the Christians that I knew that seemed to know what they believe and have a passion for God were all going to the same church. So I checked it out, and I loved it. I found myself welcomed into this multi-generational community in Nebraska, where I longed to see so many others become a part of the same. I began hearing the scriptures preached there in a way I'd never heard before. And I wanted to support that. And I wanted others to be able to experience the same mind-blowing experience that I had found there. And so I started doing something towards the end of college that I'd never done before. With each paycheck, I started designating 10% to be used for God's purposes, what's called tithing. And then a really funny thing happened. Now, I just voluntarily reduced my income by 10% after already living paycheck to paycheck. And I was a relatively new DJ, not really that good at the time, but somehow I started getting tips from my clients, like regularly. And then when the DJing got slow, somebody I met from that church offered me a job that would help make ends meet. When I needed to raise my own financial support a few months later so that I could go and be trained to do and to help others experience the same things I had experienced in college, somehow all the funds always came together, but never in the way that I imagined. And those that were the most generous givers, not the ones I expected. You see, I had over 100 donors, but amongst my top 10 were my former campus ministers, people working nonprofit, raising their own financial support to get by. But it makes sense, because God had first captured their hearts. He was their treasure, and so their money followed. You know, when Jesus has become your treasure, because your money and your treasure always end up in the same place. And so you can be generous, because the only thing that you feel you really need more of is him. You see, later in Matthew's gospel, Jesus tells two parables. In the first, he describes finding his kingdom where he is the king, like somebody who found treasure buried in a field, something so precious and so valuable that they sell everything they have to buy the field to get that treasure. And then right after that, a parable of someone, a merchant who finds a pearl so valuable that they sell everything so they can buy it. Jesus is comparing finding him, seeing him and his kingdom where he is your master, to something so precious and so valuable, such a treasure that you are willing to redirect and repurpose everything you have, even sell it all, if that's what it means to have it, to have him, because he is your treasure. He is the one that you have to have. You want him to be your master because you love him, and what leads you to love him is seeing how he first loved you. In John 17, the night before Jesus' crucifixion, we find his longest recorded prayer. And at the end of it, we find these words, "Father, I want those you have given me to be with me where I am." What did Jesus treasure so much that the night before his death, he's praying about it? What was on his mind that night? You, me, those whom the Father had given him. That's what he treasured, to be with those the Father had given him. That's what he wanted. And he knew what it would cost him to have it. The next day, Jesus would go to the cross to bear the burden of sin for all of those who would trust in him as their treasure, whose hope was not in their own godliness, as if they could gain God's favor by it, or in the things of this world, but the priceless gift of God's own rights, of Jesus' own right standing with God. You see, Jesus offered his own righteousness, his own spotless record. On the cross, Jesus suffered the judgment that your sin deserved, so that you could experience the love and the acceptance that his perfect, sinless life deserved. And he did it out of love, so that he could have you with him in glory. And when you see how Jesus treasured you, and what it cost him to do so, that's when you'll treasure him. And money will just become another tool to serve him, because he is your treasure, the one you already have. That is what you want more of, and that is what will enable your heart to be generous, because you already have what you most desire and need, having finally a full heart that's able to overflow with love and generosity to others. One man who likely felt more than any other the pull of these two would-be masters of God and mammon was a guy named Zacchaeus. We read about him in the Bible. By birth, he was Jewish, an Israelite, a son of Abraham, part of the people of God. By trade, he was a Roman tax collector, a traitor, an enemy of his own people. Tax collectors were often wealthy because their job would let them collect more taxes than they needed and pocket the difference. The perfect job for those who loved money and were willing to compromise to get it. The kind of job that would cost you friendships, or the perfect job for someone who had no friends to lose. Tax collectors were already banned from the synagogues, universally despised by their people, and yet one day, as we read in Luke 19, Zacchaeus meets Jesus. As Jesus is walking through Jericho, nobody's going to get out of wee little Zacchaeus' way so that he can see Jesus, so he has to climb a tree to get a better view. And you can just imagine the look on Zacchaeus' face as he looks down, when in a culture, the greater your house guest, the greater your own honor. Jesus sees Zacchaeus, points up to him in front of everyone, says, "I'm staying with him." And what he found in Jesus that day was like nothing he'd ever experienced, likely in years. Acceptance, affirmation, honor, in a word, love. And as that seed of love was sown in Zacchaeus' life, we see faith and repentance blooming and the fruit of love towards others. Just like that, this man who was known for greed became a man of tremendous generosity. As God's Spirit began working, this man who had defrauded others would say, "If I've defrauded anyone anything, I'll publicly commit to repay them, not double," that's what the law required, "but 4 times as much." A life of taking was beginning to be transformed into a life that gave, a life of serving the God Mammon gave way to serving the true God. And it's a picture of what happens when Jesus' love comes into your life, to our lives, when he captures your heart, freeing us from the control of what makes us foolishly store up treasures on earth, darkens our eye, and tries to serve something that could never last or infinitely love us in return. You see, Jesus finally becomes your treasure when you see how Jesus treasured you.